Okay, so
Yes.
Yes. Give me up, let's put this down. Take my head. It's really good to be in Edinburgh always, and it's particularly nice to be at a meeting which is, as it were, co-hosted by Byron Society and the Scott Society. One of the things I want to emphasise is the extremely good relationship there was between Byron and Scott. They like one another, they respected one another. And it's really nice that the two societies are together, so thank you very much for inviting me. Byron's inclusion in my question, are they the greatest Scottish writers, might raise some eyebrows. Scott was born in Scotland in a Scottish family, lived in Scotland for most of his life, and celebrated its history and its culture. Byron did not do any of these things. He was born in London, but he lived in Scotland for the first 10 years of his life. He thought of himself and was thought by those around him to be a Scot, a Gordon, steeped in the history of the Gordon, the Seton Gordon, by his mother, who was in effect a laird. He moved to England as Lord Byron when he was 10, discovered himself as a Baron, lost his Scots accent, except for a slight burn. In fact, he always sounded his final consonants, which only the Scots do really. Discovered himself as a Baron, lost his Scots accent, except for a slight burn, lived in England for 16 years, thought of himself and was thought by others to be English. His English Bards and Scotch Reviews, his first really big poem, written when he was 21, takes for granted that he is an English bard. He lives on the continent for 10 years and died in Greece. Much of that time he thought of himself as a European with Italian tinges. But towards the end of it, he increasingly acknowledged the Scottishness in him. He said that he was half a Scot by birth and bred a whole one. Almost certainly this was influenced by his reading of and intense admiration for Scott's novels, which must have reminded him of his childhood. To me, he wrote to Scott in 1822, these novels have so much of Old Lang Syne. I was bred a canny Scot till 10 years old, but I never moved without them. So, 10 years in Scotland, they were the first formative years of his life, 16 years in England, and 10 years on the continent, maybe 2 of these within the Ottoman Empire. Does this make Byron a Scotch writer? The answer clearly, and it is a frequent one when talking about Byron, is yes and no. There was enough of a yes to make my question a possible one. Yet whether it's possible in the larger sense is a different matter. The problem is with greatness. The Scott Monument here in Princes Street was the largest monument in the world to a writer when built in the 1840s. It still claims to be such because I saw it this morning. But it isn't ever. The biggest one in Haiti, which is slightly bigger, to a called Jose Marti. 68 smaller statues on the monument, 16 of which were of Scottish writers. James Hogg, Robert Burns, Robert Ferguson, Alan Ramsay, George Buchanan, Sir David Lindsay, Robert Tannehill, Lord Byron. Thought it was a Scotch writer in 1840. Tobias Smollett, James Beatty, James Thompson, John Hume, Mary Queen of Scots, King James I, King James V, and William Drummond of Hawthorne. If we added in perhaps Thomas Campbell, William Dunbar, T.S. Eliot said that Byron's ironic dedication of his greatest poem, Don Juan, to Southey, was not English satire at all, but Scottish flighty, like that of Dunbar. And also add in John Buchan and Robert Louis Stevenson. This would make a reasonable list of the greatest Scottish writers for the purposes of this talk. The other statues in the statue are characters in his fictions. The presumption of the makers of the monument was that there is such a thing as greatness, and that Scott is the greatest of Scottish writers. From my first reading of Byron, rather a long time ago, one of my favourite lines has always been, "Far other scene is Thrasimene now." That line always kills me, and I'm tempted to use it here. Far other scene. We, generalised, unspecified, we, are quite happy to celebrate the greatest footballer or greatest goal in history or the greatest pop star or pop tune, but we're much more cautious about saying that a writer or politician is great. We readily put up statues to comedians. Morecambe and Wise have 3. Indeed, statues to footballers, there's one of Pelé in Brazil. But we are less ready to honour generals, artists, monarchs, saints or politicians in the grand way that we used to. There was a bust of T.S. Eliot by Epstein in Walsall and a statue of D.H. Lawrence in Nottingham University. The statue of Eric Morecambe in Morecambe was unveiled by the late Queen. But there is some anxiety attaching to the possible form of any large-scale monument to the Queen herself. The proposed designs that I have seen mostly incorporate a statue that want to reference more than just an image of the Queen. There are unremarkable statues in London of George VI in his consort that do just that. There's a small statue of the late Queen in York Minster. A national monument would have to suggest that Elizabeth was a great queen, which in my view she was. Sculptors and public taste have become unused to greatness of traditional kinds. An exception is Alexander Stoddart, who makes impressive statues of public figures in a neoclassical style. There's a statue of David Hume in Edinburgh, I think, done by him. He is self-consciously oppositional in this. Exception proves the rule. Did you notice that I just mentioned David Hume? Built into this is a lack of interest or confidence in long-term memorialisation. No one expects that statues of Morecambe and Wise will be honoured in a couple of centuries. Whereas those who honoured the fashion with Scott statue or the Victorian statue of Byron in Hyde Park, the National Monument, now marooned on a traffic island, was about to be moved at least considerable expense and by a great deal of effort by a few admirably determined people back to a prominent place in the park. That was taken for granted that these statues would have meaning for hundreds of years. This latter movement is now unusual. The casual way in which a national monument to a great poet ended up unloved and unnoticed on a traffic island is, I fear, more representative. The most obvious question that this suggests is whether the presumptions of democracy oppose celebrating, admiring, or even noticing greatness. Equality inherently rules out distinction and distinctions. This is a modern question, and on the whole I think we would tend to shrink from posing. De Tocqueville presumably was the first to actually pose it. But not quite in that explicit form, it was certainly a question that concerned Scott and Byron, and they brought it to the attention of their readers. Both Byron and Scott were fascinated by history, and this partly forms and founds their imaginative writings. Theirs was a general interest with diverse histories, both write about all manner of past cultures. But Byron had a particular concern with the movement from the 18th to the 19th century, where he sided with the 18th century culturally. He idolised the poetry of Alexander Pope, and with the 19th century politically. His classical plays often centre in what we could see as liberal revolutions against settled political forms, which fail for reasons both good and bad. They are not intended, as some people tend to suggest they are, as allegories of the French Revolution and its rouge et noir aftermath. But they are part of Byron's intense interest in the political changes of his time. He was born the year before the 1789 revolution, and he was writing verses from the time of the Peninsular War, which he partly witnessed, until the 1820s, when there were liberal revolutionary stirrings in Spain, Italy, and Greece. He participated directly in the last two. These movements and counter-movements informed his poetry and his self. George Lukács argued that the period of colossal change, 1780 to 1820, became a sort of mass experience of history for those who lived through it, and that this is linked with their interest in Scott's novels, which are characteristically concerned with the interaction between individual lives and historical change. The first novelist, I think, to be so concerned. Scott was 19 when the storming of the Bastille occurred, same age as Wordsworth. But virtually all his novels were written in the period when both the Revolution and Napoleon had been halted, even apparently reversed. His main historical concern was with the changes in Scottish history and self-understanding, a self-understanding which he, more than anyone, helped to shape, from the 17th to the 18th centuries, which produced modern Scotland. This is the background of his greatest novels. For both writers, the ambiguous status of heroism, that primal form of greatness, is closely bound up with the historical changes in which they were most interested. Scott, for instance, though loyal to the particularities of the histories that he presents, emphasises a single pattern in them. From Waverley to Red Gauntlet, he sees history as fallen through conflicts into which his heroes are drawn. Edward Waverley, like most of Scott's male protagonists, is a weak character, deliberately so, since this enables him to be taken up into large events which he does not initiate, the opposite of the Byronic hero. Scott's only major female heroine, Jenny Deans in Heart of Midlothian, is the opposite of this. She can change the mind of the Queen of England. Waverley is swept up into the dramatic events of 1745, meets Boniface Charlie, is strongly influenced by Fergus MacIver and his sister Flora, but he settles in the end at a safer Rose of Bradwardine and an undramatic future in undramatic Hallelujah England, which, post-1746, will see no further internal wars. The novel takes its life from conflict, delights in it, but is at pains not to endorse it. Such conflict exalts heroism, produces characters like Fergus MacIver, and for a short while appears to reinstate a world ruled by concepts of honour rather than legal and commercial contracts. Waverley is caught up in these things, but both he and the novel finally repudiate them and accept the Hanoverian future. In doing so, they settle knowingly for a world where greatness belongs in the past, though it may be visited by the imagination. That is the pattern in most of the Scottish novels. It is at its most precarious in Bride of Lammermoor and Red Gauntlet. In the former, the animosity between Edgar Ravenswood and the Ashtons is the familiar conflict between the precarious survival of a romance and heroic past and an unglamorous but prosperous bourgeois future. It should be resolved, as in Waverley and lots of Scott's novels, by the union of Ravenswood and Lucy Ashton. But that is thwarted by her mother, a character whom Scott directs us to loathe more than any other of his characters. The novel ends with the most withering final sentence of any novel known to me. A splendid marble monument records her name, titles, and virtues, but her victims remain undistinguished by tomb or epitaph. Full stop. End of novel. The unacceptable future lies with her and people like her, rather than with the dark grandeur of Ravenswood, a character with clear traces of the Byronic hero. All that is left of him and the past that he represents is a large sable feather from his hat, which survived its owner's extinction in the quicksand. That, I think, is about as dark as Scott ever gets. Yet, in a way, the end of Red Gauntlet, though precisely endorsing a bright and peaceful Hanoverian future, is darker still. This bright future, superseding conflict, is offered in General Campbell's words towards the remaining half-hearted Jacobites. The king, George III, has kind purposes towards you all. The all here includes the would-be King Charles III, who is present. Red Gauntlet, the last representative of the world of Flora Ferguson and Flora MacIver, hearing this and clasping his hands together as the words burst from him, says, "And the cause is lost forever." So the last scene of the novel does not suggest a bright future. Red Gauntlet and the Stuart king in a small boat sail away from Britain into a future which places no value on heroism. It is a vivid picture, which is both deeply moving and almost comical. The best thing in the novel is this final section, in which we're made to enter into the embarrassment of Jacobites who could no longer act or even pretend to act on the honour principles which they theoretically uphold. I think that Scot probably is the only novelist who could so convincingly imagine and sustain a scene like that. The gauntlet has to swallow the unpalatable truth that the world of honour, bound up with conflict, is now simply lost forever. Byron's fictions are less inserted into documented history than Scott's novels. His later tales and classical tragedies are historically placed, but the Turkish tales and Manfred are in unspecified times. It was the success of the Turkish tales from 1803, of course, that turned Scott into a novelist in the first place, since he knew that his tales would not match Byron's. Byron hits the mark, he told James Valentine, where I don't even pretend to fledge my anger. The first novel, Waverley, that resulted from this, was read by Byron with rapture. He told Mary that it was the best and the most interesting novel that I've read since I don't know when. Besides, it is all easy to me, because I have been in Scotland so much, though then young enough too, and feel at home with the people, lowland and gay. Scott's first novel, published anonymously but widely recognised to be by him, received almost the same sort of huge public success, almost unprecedented, that Byron's The Corsair, also published in 1814, received. Scott's switch to prose proved to be the right choice. Jane Austen, of course, wrote, "Walter Scott has no business to write novels, especially good ones. It is not fair. He has fame and profit enough as a poet. Should not be taking the bread out of other people's mouths. I do not like it, and I do not mean to like Waverley if I can help it. But fear I must." She got a better reception than anything else, I guess. The differences between The Corsair and Waverley are obvious, but I suspect that their immense popularity rested on shared ground. The best phrase that I can sum up for this is illicit glamour. Edward Waverley has no political affiliations. His father is a Whig. When he goes up into the Highlands, he is absorbed into the romance glamour of Bonnybridge Charlie, Flora MacIver, and wild scenery, and momentarily places his allegiance there. Wrong choice, as the novel finally presents it. But the reader, surprised and delighted, is taken into this wrong choice too, whilst knowing that it is unsustainable beyond the act of reading. Something similar happens in Byron's The Corsair, which is a hugely popular poem. From its opening, "O'er the glad waters of the dark blue sea, our thoughts as boundless and our souls as free," we sympathise with the life and even the ethic of pirates and Conrad, their chief, that man of loneliness and mystery. Rather than with the settled social life that the Corsairs attack. Gulnair has the illicit glamour of Flora MacIver and wields authority over Conrad, just as Flora does over Edward Waverley. But Waverley settles, as we saw, for Rosa Bradwardine, whereas her equivalent in The Corsair, Medora, dies. Both Scott and Byron take us into interior sympathy, even identification, with exotic and extreme modes of life, feelings and ideas that the reader is unfamiliar with and either rejects or thinks impossible in modern times. Scott, accepting the Bride of Lammermoor in the Gauntlet, always ends with a comfortable future which turns away from these, whereas Byron, in his most Byronic writings, does not. An exception is Byron's very last tale, which now was never much talked about, now it's talked about quite a lot, The Island, written in 1823. That ends very much in the Scott manner. A future for one couple in a peaceful society, and a dreadful end for the glamorous rebels. It is quite likely this was influenced by his reading of Scott. But the difference between them is manifest in their activities in the previous year. In 1822, Scott was stage managing George IV's appearance as a Scottish king in a kilt in Scotland. The English royal family still put that later. Scott was helping to construct a future which both acknowledged the past and yet moved into new territory. In the same year, Byron was writing The Age of Bronze, a dismal survey of European politics, which presents the times he lives in as an age of bronze fallen for silver in golden past. Only in the revolutionary stirrings in parts of Europe in the 1820s, to which Scot would have been wholly opposed, are there any grounds of hope. These basic differences, both in viewpoint and temperament, must have been the main reasons that made Scot worried about meeting Byron for the first time in 1815. The porter prepared me to meet a man of peculiar habit and a quick temper, Scot wrote later, and I had some doubts whether we were likely to suit each other in society. I was most agreeably disappointed in this respect. I found Lord Byron in the highest degree courteous and even kind. We met for an hour or two almost daily in Mr. Murray's drawing room and found a great deal to say to each other. They met frequently between April and September 1815, nearly every day. The last time that they met, Scot wrote to Byron, "I never saw him so full of fun, frolic, wit, and whim. He was as playful as a kitten." As this suggests, Byron and Scot liked one another tremendously. They got on. They agreed about more or less everything apart from religion and politics. Scot and Byron wrote poems on Waterloo, both had visited the battlefield, but from absolutely opposed perspectives. They never ever fell out about politics. Each thought that the other was a great writer. Byron dedicated his play Cain to Scot. His letters and journals indicate that he alludes to Scot more often than to any other author except Shakespeare. He quotes from 15 of his works, which is rather more than I'm doing in this lecture. He called him the Ariosto of the North. John Clubb suggested that Byron meant by the phrase that Scot was, quote, master of comedy, superb storyteller, and ironic epic poet, who understood history and could body forth its essence in memorable characters and in narratives that, ostensibly fiction, captured historical truth. Byron was particularly touched by Scot's review of Childe Pilgrimage Canto 3 in 1816, in which Scot praises poet and poem, but expresses real sympathy with Byron in his new exile post the collapse of his marriage. Byron had received much hostile comment on this, but Scot writes, "It has been, however, reserved for our own time to produce one distinguished example of the muse having descended on a bard of a wounded spirit, and lent her lyre to tell, and we trust to soothe, affections of no ordinary description, afflictions originating probably in that singular combination of feeling which has been called the poetical temperament, which has so often saddened the days of those on whom it has been conferred. If ever a man could lay claim to that character in all its strength and all its weakness, with its unbounded range of enjoyment and its exquisite sensibility of pleasure and of pain, it must certainly be granted to Lord Byron. Nor does it require much time or a deeper acquaintance with human nature to discover why these extraordinary powers should, in many cases, have contributed more to the wretchedness than the happiness of their possessor. In the concluding paragraph, Scot writes, Lord Byron may not have loved the world, but the whole world has loved him. Byron, not at all convinced at that time that the world, and more especially England, loved him, was both grateful for this extremely influential support Scot was widely respected and admired, and for the evident personal sympathy that Scot expressed for the grief, psychological, almost metaphysical, that propels much of the third canto of Childe Harold, in which both intrigued and puzzled Scot. Here he ascribes it tactfully to Byron's poetical temperament. Both Scot and Byron were accepted as great writers, but were they themselves concerned with greatness in their writings? Their texts are full of references to kings, warriors, and famous people of all kinds, far more so than any other romantic writers. Scot gives largely positive readings of Montrose in the Legend of Montrose, and Saladin in the Talisman, but he customarily presents figures, famous figures, as mixed in their vices and virtues. His Bonnetford's Charlie, for example, is allowed a certain glamour, even grace, but he represents political failure and is entangled embarrassingly with a bossy mistress in their quarter. Byron's extended portrait of Napoleon in Childe Harold, written just after Waterloo, presents him as far more substantial than this, but he too is a mixture of high and low. There sank the greatest, nor the worst of men, whose spirit antithetically mixed, one moment at the mightiest, and again on little objects, with like firmness fixed. Byron here uses the word greatest of Napoleon, which is preceded by sunk. In the Age of Bronze, 6 years later, Byron bemoans Napoleon's further reduction on St. Helena, the queller of the nations, now squabbling daily or disputed rations. Weep to perceive him mourning as he dines o'er curtailed dishes and o'er stinted wine, or petty quarrels upon petty things. Is this the man who scourged or feasted kings? Byron's extended account of Rousseau, which is associated with his portrait of Napoleon, similarly presents him as both inspired and frenzied, the two terms tending rather to blur. Baronic heroes represent a similar doubleness. Conrad, in the Corsair, is not instantly remarkable. No giant frame sets forth his common height, yet, in the whole, who paused to look again, saw more than marks the crowds of vulgar men. That implies some sort of manifest greatness. Conrad's arrival on his island at the beginning of the poem and meeting with Medora are operatically glamorous. But then he bounds down from the cliff, from the tower where she dwells, until his footsteps reach the verge where ends the cliff, begins the beach. There checks his speed. He does so because he is about to meet his men and must subdue them by careless superiority in his manner, rather than anything resembling haste or bonhomie. So he alters immediately his mode of walking. For well had Conrad learnt to curb the proud by arts that veil and oft preserve the crown. His greatness, then, is as much the result of calculated appearance as of natural force. Byron's mantra, the apogee of Byronic heroes, is almost ridiculous in his failed suicide attempt on the Jungfrau, is rebuked by the chamois hunter, and has an ambiguous rather than heroic death. But it would be odd not to see him as some sort of greatness, an emblem of some sort of greatness. He is not antithetically mixed. Jeffrey's 1817 review of Manfred saw him as a being invested with superhuman attributes, in order that he may be capable of more than human suffering, and be sustained under them by more than human force and pride. He is in effect a Superman. Nietzsche, who composed the piano piece based on Manfred, applied the word Übermensch, Superman, to Byron himself. There were no Supermen in Scott's poems and novels, nor in his view of the world. Though, for instance, he saw Wellington as some sort of a hero, and was appalled that Byron did not. Nietzsche did not invent the word. Goethe had called Faust an Übermensch in his play. Nietzsche presents the Superman or Overman as a rebuking antithesis to a modern, ordinary man. And he was right, I think, to see this in Manfred. Though the play, Byron is always more complicated than you think, in its second act deliberately puts together an ordinary man and chamois hunter in conversation with Manfred. Each tries to come to terms with the other, and very nearly does so. Faust and Don Juan are two great ambiguous villain heroes of the Renaissance. They are supermen who advertise forbidden but covertly envied energies. Goethe revives and transforms Faust, and was convinced, not quite correctly, that Byron's Manfred derives wholly from it. Byron transforms the traditional Don Juan. His Juan is the antithesis of both Faust and his Manfred. He begins the poem, I want a hero. These four words point in different directions. It is witty to begin a poem as though it's not already thought out, but in formation and therefore in league with the reader in being so. Byron keeps this posture throughout the poem, though we know it's called Don Juan, so it must be a posture. In the larger self, Byron himself does want a hero. The nearest he has found is Napoleon, now defeated. He bemoans the absence of heroism in the modern world. You might think that the Napoleonic Wars would throw up lots and lots of heroes, as many, including Scott, did. Nelson, Byron said, was Britannia's god of war. But Byron denies them the heroic status that contemporary newspapers conferred on them. There were lots of Regency newspapers, in London alone there were about 40. I want a hero, an uncommon want, when every year and month sends forth a new one, till after cloying the gazettes, that's newspapers, with cant, the age discovers he is not the true one. Thank you. Byron usually gets a laugh. He goes on to list 31 recent European heroes. Napoleon here reduced to one party, he's included, all of whom he rejects. Juan is chosen because Byron has put himself into Scott's shoes. He does not want a Byronic hero anymore, but a protagonist who, like Edward Waverley or Henry Morton in The Old Mortality, can be caught up into situations that they have not initiated. Love affairs, a shipwreck, slavery, a large historic battle, political entanglements, various kinds of social life, even the ghost. This is Byron's equivalent in Don Juan to the cinematic reign of Scott's novels, and perhaps was influenced by them. Byron also wants to turn his established hero inside out, not the calculating Don Juan of Tirso de Molina, the invented character, or Molière, or Mozart, but a little curly-headed, good-for-nothing, and mischief-making monkey from his birth. Byron's Juan would be dominated by women rather than dominating them. Women ruled the roost in Don Juan, not Byronic or any other kind of male hero. Byron is far more interested in sex than Scott is, and he's much better at presenting it. True. In Scott's novels, the outcome of sexual love is dictated by forms of historical change. That is why Ravenswood cannot marry Lucy Ashton. But Byron, as interested in historical change as Scott, sees sexual love as a huge, unstoppable force in its own right, which sometimes alters history, as it did after all with Anne Boleyn. That is one of the reasons that Byron puts Catherine the Great into Don Juan. Scott, very sympathetic to Mary Queen of Scots, and not only because he's drawn to lost romantic causes, is not much concerned with her love affairs and sexuality and the political effects of these. They are not foregrounded in his impressive portrait of her in The Abbot, whereas Byron would be fascinated by these interconnections. The same is true of Scott's life of Napoleon, though he writes very intelligently about the relationship between Napoleon and Josephine. It is perhaps worth dwelling a little longer on Byron and Scott's relationship with Napoleon. Like him or loathe him, he was certainly thought to be the greatest man of the age. But of course, that is the placing of Beethoven, or for that matter, Byron and Scott. Byron called Goethe the greatest man in Germany, perhaps of Europe, which would put him above Napoleon. Byron and Scott see the same Napoleon, but they place him differently. Scott did not have any hang-ups about Napoleon. He recognised his importance and wanted to understand him as comprehensively and squarely as possible. That is what he tried to do with considerable success in his 9-volume Life of the Emperor, with it written amazingly within the space of a year, 1827. It was written more racily than his novels. It's based on very extensive reading and access to archive material allowed by the government, that's material relating to Napoleon's time in St. Helena. I must confess to being only acquainted not with the 9-volume version, but the abridged version of 484 pages, dated 2014. Scott stresses Napoleon's huge strategic abilities, his battle prowess, his humaneness, even amiability, despite the violence which he initiated, his political skills and public works. But he acknowledges Napoleon's egotism, pride, deceptions, and unqualified love of power. He seems, said Scott, to justify and take pride in the ravage that he had occasioned. Like Byron, he is appalled at the pettiness of Napoleon's complaints on St. Helena, and by Napoleon's invocation of liberty, when in practice he always opposed it. Scott is trying to be fair, and I think, by and large, that he is. Ruskin liked and understood both Byron and Scott. Ruskin's criticism of Byron and Scott is always very impressive. He particularly loved Scott's poetry and Byron's letters. I like his notion of the poet as a seer with a capital S. Seers without a capital S simply have excellent powers of observation. They attend to what is. Seers with a capital S do more than this. They see into things, and they behold what is given to them, rather than what they choose to observe. Byron and Scott, we can add in Tolstoy, who was clearly influenced by Scott, certainly seers with a small s. They attend, often with astonishing fidelity, to landscapes, people, events, and things as they are. We could label them Aristotelian. But Byron is also a seer with a capital S. He attends, he also receives, more so than Scott, I think. Nietzsche said somewhere, I read it, I can't remember where I read it, that we should live as though surrounded by spirits. Byron, for all his Regency persona, does exactly this. Scott did not, despite his immense ability to conjure up the past. And yet Scott does more than simply see in the sense of attend. His sense of human entanglement with historical processes, which often produce quite different futures than those who bring them about envisage or want, he was extremely good on that. And his acute sense of the relationship between human figures and landscapes, both a sort of intimacy and sometimes alienation. Henry Morton, appalled by Burley in his cliff cave behind a vast waterfall at the end of All Mortality, for instance, or the hunter alone in the landscape in the opening section of the Lady of the Lake, which is a magnificent passage. These could not be found in, say, the novels of Balzac. Balzac usually admired Scott and was influenced by him. But his novels, unlike those of Tolstoy, are, in my view, always those of the seer with a small s. In the case of Napoleon, however, Scott, though acute and comprehensive, is never a seer with a capital S. Byron's sense of Napoleon both exceeds that of Scott, yet in some sense he is clearly inferior in his grasp. He was obsessed by him since his childhood. Famously had a bust of him when he was at school at Harrow, and after all, we were at war with him at that time. Where Scott was appalled by Napoleon's self-belief in his superior partners and destiny, Byron approves. How should he, Byron writes in his journal, who knows mankind well, who otherwise than despise and abhor them? Byron's comments on Napoleon, his superiority to ordinary folk, was exactly the same as the poet's comment in his dark hero Connor, which I read at the beginning of the lecture, who paused to look again, saw more than marks the crowd of vulgar men. Napoleon, an ironic hero. Byron said of himself that he was born for opposition, and he was. Scott wasn't. And he saw Napoleon as the arch opposer of things as they are, a social order linked both to past monarchical forms, which increasingly geared to mediocrity. Nietzsche, who admired Byron, of course, in Thus Spake Zarathustra, coined the term Letzter Mensch, the last man, as the antithesis of the Superman. The last man, that is modern man, values comfort, security, the avoidance of risk above all. Byron saw Napoleon as the antithesis to this, a risk taker on a giant scale. He warmed to him and was appalled by his fine subjugation. He wanted him to die as a hero, was appalled the way he kind of surrendered. That is one huge strain in Byron. It is not the only one. Byron, like Scott, admired common sense, and he had a huge comic ability to demonstrate human limitation. But there is a strain in Byron, an impulse to the vast, the abyssal even, often linked with darkness, and curiously, human psychology. The Shakespeare play he most often references is Macbeth, which is something that Scott could not really comprehend, and he sometimes says as much. Byron often hovers on the edge of the metaphysical. Scott never does. Writers, artists of all kinds, are often rivals, adversaries. Byron and Wordsworth, Byron and Southey, Schoenberg and Stravinsky, Matisse and Picasso. In the late 19th century, Brahms and Bruckner were often set against one another. Edward Hanslick, the leading Brahms critic in Vienna, wrote that Bruckner's Eighth Symphony, in my view, one of the greatest of all symphonies, was interminable, disorganized, violent. Certainly, Brahms's and Bruckner's views on symphonies and on life were very different. They had very different personalities. They met once and went to a cafe. Conversations were dismally slow and awkward. But then they discovered they both loved sausages. The conversation really took off. Scott and Byron did not need sausages as something to talk about. They could, and indeed did, talk from the outset about all manner of things. I found their relationship impressive, exemplary, and indeed heartwarming. A year after Byron's death, Scott wrote to Moore, "I very often think of him, almost with tears. Each saw and what had the best in each other." Now that would be a good concluding sentence, wouldn't it? But then I would face the charge, we've talked of music and Napoleon and greatness and all kinds of things. You haven't once tried to answer the question, are they the greatest Scottish writers? Well, the sheer range of scenes, places, peoples, and the varied forms and modes of writing they present certainly exceed by far those of any other Scottish writer. Their works and their literary forms have had far more effect, absolutely colossal effect, on British, European, and even world literature, more so than any other Scottish writer. Not only on literature, but music too. Donizetti's Lucia di Lammermoor, Tchaikovsky and Schumann's Manfred, etc., etc. And it is a very huge, etc., the amount of influence they have on music. This might well suggest that they are indeed Scotland's greatest writers. But their huge reputation in the 19th century led to almost a backlash from the mid-20th century British criticism. Neither fitted the attitudes and assumptions of that time, very subconsciously anti-19th century, to poetry or the novel, and they were patronised. In the last 50 years, there has been something of a renewal of affirmative interest in Byron, less so, unfortunately, in Scott, who is not attacked now, but he's more neglected than critiqued. When I first studied literature in a formal way, as Scott would say, to 60 years since, Dr. Leavis ruled the roost, and only allowed into it Jane Austen, George Eliot, Henry James, and Joseph Conrad as novelists, and Donald and Jerry Manley Hopkins as poets. Scott did not get a look in. He accused Scott of not possessing, quote, the creative writer's interest in literature. He loved praising, dismissing, and ranking texts. Leavis scared the life out of everyone. I was never a Leavisite, though I did once attend a lecture by him. He would be a caustic critic of my talk. Where is the evaluation, he would say. Evaluation was the key word with him. Well, Byron and Scott certainly write extremely well. They produce complex, cohering structures which both utilize inherited forms and profoundly modify them. And they most certainly do have the creative writer's interest in literature. For my money, they're clearly the greatest Scottish writers. But if I were forced by Dr. Leavis or his ghost to try to prove their preeminence over all the Scottish writers on the Scot volumes, or place in rank order Burns's Tam O'Shanter, Byron's Division of Judgment, Scott's Rob Roy, and Muriel Sparks' The Crime of Miss Jean Brodie, then frankly, I would wriggle out of it. I would say to Dr. Leavis, in the broad Scots that I picked up from reading Scott's novels, dinner fash yourself. Thank you.
applause on so long I thought we were going to run out of time for questions. But checking my watch, we do have a little bit of time left, and Bernard's kindly agreed to take some questions or comments from the audience. We don't have a roving mic, but I think if you speak loudly, we should be able to hear you. Unless... correction, we do have a roving mic. Hands, please, if you have a question or a comment. Drummond, first of all.
Do I wait for the microphone or do I not?
I think if we... Sorry.
Anyway, what I was going to say was the ones, Scott, Bernard, you didn't mention, which seemed a bit odd given the subject, Carlyle.
Yes.
Could you expand on that? Yes, just a
I was
tad.
quite pleased with my answer. It had brevity and force. Anyhow, any more questions?
Peter at the front there.
Thank you very much for that terrific lecture. I wonder if you could just perhaps pinpoint a moment or a reason why Byron's attitude to Napoleon changed. Because when you were quoting, when you said that he quoted from Macbeth more than any other player, I was thinking of those quotations at the top of the Ode to Napoleon, where he refers to kissing the ground for young Malcolm's feet. And he sort of sees him almost as a Promethean figure who fails because he took on too much or perhaps offended the gods. So was there a specific thing which changed his mind?
No, Byron, his best account of Napoleon is Childe Harold 3, where he gives about 3 or 4 stanzas on Napoleon, which are very good, very nice. Well, I read a little bit of it, but they're very nicely judged because Byron never, I'd almost say, had a crush on Napoleon. Nevertheless, he always saw things wrong with him, so to speak. He was an emblem of something that deeply appealed to Byron. Yet he always saw things wrong with him. What he couldn't forgive, I think, was the way he simply accepted capture and subjugation at the end, and all the kind of stories that came out very rapidly, of course, of how he behaved on St. Helena and all that. And Byron simply couldn't forgive Byron for being such a maddeningly unheroic figure. That was the trick. But he always saw him, though his whole thrust of his being naturally went to Napoleon, he always saw limitations and wrongness in Napoleon. I think that was a much easier question.
Eric? Oh, sorry.
Bernard, on the Leavis evaluation schedule, could you make a comment on the afterlife of both of them? Because reception studies are got absolute tonnages now on both, and much is about how both of them have been taken into British studies abroad. So there must be a hyper-greatness classification in terms of multiples of books and bibliography of them all on the afterlife of their work. Is there another criterion that would back up what you're saying?
As I said, I think this is working. As I said, he was riding high, and he was peculiar in almost ferocity. It was to do with this rather strange personality. I shouldn't say all this, but now I'm saying it. He came to Birmingham University, and gave a lecture which I heard earlier, on Dombey and so on, which was a mixed lecture, huge audience. And I didn't go to the lunch which was arranged for him, but the people in the English department who were at the lunch, they did nothing else but tear absolutely everybody in Cambridge to pieces. That's what he did. And Leavis had this, people were frightened of him. But he wasn't he alone that was, so to speak, privileging the fact that what we mostly need to do with literature was taught, say, in 1920, as it was in 1890, primarily through historical periods. And here's the period, and this is the sort of thing they did in those times. What Leavis wanted above all was essentially a naked confrontation with the text, where you're on trial as well as the text, and you have to pass judgment on it. Is it good? And it always has a moral tinge. This is how you learn to discriminate in life. For Leavis, literature was the main means that human beings learn how to make moral distinctions and evaluations, and that's the main business of being alive. That was his main thrust. He wasn't alone in that, but he was the main one. But after these, of course, there was, as always, there's always a swing, isn't there, the opposite. People went to exactly the opposite. No, texts aren't isolated things in the individual reader. The individual reader is formed by past kind of assumptions that they don't even know they have. And the literature of the time is formed by all kinds of historical interrelations with previous texts and all the rest of it. So you get historicism, where you privilege the historic, the emergence of literary texts out of history. Often it's tinged with a sort of bastardized Marxism. So there was a reaction against these. And there's been no counter, no one now, as far as I know, is trying to reinstate these. The whole business of fundamental engagement we have with literature is the individual reader making an evaluation of what really of the attitude to life contained within the words of the text. I think no one sticks up for that. And part of me, though I was against Leeds because he dominated everything, part of me thinks it would be quite nice if some of that came back, actually. That isn't quite an answer to your question, but it answers the spirit of it.
One more question.
Thank you. Thank you, Byron. That was wonderful. I was interested in the relationship between greatness and individualism.
Focus.
Sorry?
What's the first word?
Greatness.
Oh, greatness and individualism.
Does this work?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Greatness and individualism, because I was quite struck by the quote from Luke actually that you mentioned at the beginning, the
Yes.
mass experience of history that characterises Byron's and Scott's age.
Yes.
And yet there seems to be the quest for sort of embodiment of greatness, like Hegel when he sees Napoleon right through, that he sort of embodies the world's spirit.
Yeah.
There's sort of, are they sort of trying to square both the kind of mass experience of history with trying to embody that sort of other world historical figure themselves? Byron fashioned himself the grand Napoleon of the Rose.
Yes, yes. Well, I'm sort of picking out from that. I'm really thinking about the relationship between greatness, where you see greatness as I try to describe it, as historically understood. But greatness is partly a phenomenon of what you can't explain. A great man, forgive me saying man, because I always have to say person, but it's often man, simply alive, so to speak, and they're always more than the ordinary. They're beyond the normal, the ordinary, and the rest of it. They have some force. But the emphasis on the individual, which you put against that, is more or less the opposite of that. We're all more or less equally individual. We're all diverse, but none of us actually is terribly interesting. Was that an answer or sort?
I think there's time for one more question just behind you there with you.
Yeah, I think the mics are disturbed. I was really interested in the title of your lecture set because I would have thought that Byron and Walter Scott, were different because Scott paid Turner to paint his pictures. Byron didn't get on with the late poets, particularly Wordsworth. So I would have thought they were opposed artistically, yet they weren't. So how artistically they were different, or is that not right? One was a romantic and Byron wasn't.
No, Byron wasn't.
Byron
wasn't. Byron, sorry, it's a boring answer, but Byron was, yes and no.
Right.
He was a neoclassicist, and he was certainly a romantic,
Right.
romantic. In all kinds of obvious ways. The principal connection between them is their understanding that history forms things. They both have that sense. They see literature naturally, as so to speak, bringing that out so we can sort of, as it were, participate in it. So, in that way, they're similar. In their feeling for landscape, for example, their feeling for individual figures. Yes, they're very similar. Formally, Scott and Byron actually loved, and he criticises them, he actually loved Scott's long poems, The Longer the Hours, Lake, the Lake, and undoubtedly he was influenced by them when he wrote his tales. As I say, his tales got much better reception than Scott's. So there was a real similarity there. In other respects, they are extremely different. There's no question whatsoever. And presumably, as always, in any kind of strong relationship, a strong relation to family, but on similarity and difference, and sort of going across that. And Byron Scott, I don't praise it too much, but I think that relationship was absolutely exemplary. It was a wonderful relationship. It cheers me up.
Well, thank you for taking those questions, Bernard. And
I didn't take drummers out.
Drummond will survive.
For artfully dodging one question and taking the rest, thank you so much. And thank you also for your lecture. I should introduce myself because I realise it's not just a Scot event this evening, a joint one, the Byron Society and indeed the University. So I'm David McClay, I'm the Honorary Secretary of the Edinburgh Subaltern Scot Club, but also well known to the Byron Society. So I'm particularly delighted we had such a good audience along this evening to hear the lecture jointly hosted. And Bernard, was it appropriate that in a discussion of greatness, we had a great lecture from a great speaker. You were able to blend erudition, humour, a deep sympathy and learning, and all very effortlessly. Who else would bring together not just Byron and Scott, but Wellington and Napoleon, Nietzsche and Goethe, George IV and Elizabeth II, Schumann, Austen, Morecambe and Wise. You also, in your pairings, got poetry and prose, sex and romance, life and legacy. Truly, we're in the presence of greatness. He helped us to recognise the brilliance of both Scott and Byron, their tremendous popularity, their genius and their originality. They would have been flattered, I'm sure, by this close association and would have argued heatedly against each other about who was superior, arguing that the other was. True. But we learned, I think, something also from Byron and Scott, that friendship can be forged even when you disagree on things such as politics. Hopefully some of us can take that away with us this evening, but hopefully we can also take away from your lecture this evening. If you haven't read much Scott, that he's worth reading. If you haven't read much Byron, he's also worth reading. If you haven't read either of them, well, what the hell have you been doing? Whether they're the greatest Scottish writers or merely worth reading, I think there can be little doubt that we need to read more of them. And I would use this final few comments and a few thanks and a couple of encouragements. If you would like to learn more about Byron or indeed about Scott, the Byron Society and the Edinburgh Subaltern Scot Club have extensive programmes. They're both easy to join and you'll find not only intellectual and cultural stimulation with them both, but great friendship and sociability as well. Although the Byron Society, as Emily mentioned, may be based in London, many of their events are online and they have a wide range of speakers, as indeed does the Scot Society. The Scot Club does have two events coming up which I would like to highlight, particularly as there's a slight change in approach. We host a colloquium, which is more of an academic discussion than some of our broader ranging talks and events. The topic of this is the Crusader novels, which are celebrating their bicentenary this year, but the broader theme is that of chivalry. So we're looking forward to some interesting papers being delivered for that. There is still time to propose a paper. It can be a shorter or longer paper on any of these broad topics of the Crusader novels or chivalry. Please do get in touch with me via the website if you're interested in delivering something there. We were originally conceiving of this as an in-person event, but because of the broader interest across the UK and further afield, we're thinking we may switch that to online. The one advantage to that, one, you can watch it in your pyjamas from anywhere in the world, but also we can make it free as well. So hopefully that will encourage not just more participants in terms of speakers, but also attendees as well. So do check out our website for the information on that. The second and final event I wanted to promote is we're organising a definitely physical event, which is a trip to Aberdeen, the home of Subaltern Scot and the Borders. I know some of our Byronic friends popped down there today, so if you need any encouragement to go, just speak to them. It should be a special occasion to go. If you have been before, you've not been in the company of the Edinburgh Winter Scot Club. Guaranteed to be much more fun, in particular because our friends at Abbotsford are going to look out some of the treasures which aren't normally on public display, especially for our visit. What better day to do it than on Scott's birthday, the 15th of August. So though we have a bit of time to prepare for that, we do need people to commit fairly soon so we can start making the logistical arrangements. So a few final thanks, first of all to Emily and to the Byron Society. I think the annual Scottish Byron lecture continues to go from strength to strength. I hope it will continue for many years in the future. Again, keep an eye on their website for what we'll be doing next year. Thank you also to Jerry, who not only helped organise the venue and so on, but also co-hosted the drinks. It wasn't just the Scot Club that was generous in that regard. And for those of you who are looking down the programme for later on in the year, Jenny will be wearing a slightly different hat, possibly that hat, but will also be giving us a lecture later on in the programme as well. But the final thanks, of course, must return to Bernard, who's provided us with a wonderful lecture this evening, brought out such a good audience, which I know have appreciated it, and we appreciate you, Bernard. I know it was a long way to come to deliver this lecture. We're deeply honoured by the presence and your wonderful lecture that you gave us this evening. Thank you.